What is up, everyone? How's everyone doing? In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the Mangird XENNS top. So let's get started. I'm going to talk about the build, cable, and fit. So this cable is actually kind of cheap. The problem I have is like it gets a little tangled up, and then the chin slider. This thing goes all over the place. I don't know how or what, but this cable is really cheap. And then this is a detachable plug. But like every time I'm using this and I unplug it, sometimes the whole thing just pops out. As you can see so this is removable. I'm not a fan of that because it's just annoying. And I don't have to swap terminals in the first place, so I don't really need it there. But yeah, that's the cable build quality. You guys have probably seen this design a million times now. Like the D-Audio Oracle and Monarch. It's basically using that type of resin, really light. The build quality is okay. It's not too bad. The design is really nice though. It looks better in person. It looks like Green Goblin or Infinity Stones or something like that. But looks decent. Not bad. But now let's get into the sound quality, which is why everyone's probably watching this video. So first I'm going to talk about the bass, mids, and the treble. And then a little bit about the soundstage and imaging. And then I'll get into comparisons. So without further ado, let's get started. So starting off with the bass. It has a really high quality bass sound. It's deep, punchy, rumbly. Pretty much kind of sounds like a subwoofer. So if you like bass, this has it in spades. It's rich, textured, has the right amount of bounce. It's controlled better. It never sounds like too thin when I'm listening to drums and other instruments. So good amount, decent amount of bass, good quality bass. It's really well controlled. And it sounds good. And then the mid-bass amount is pretty neutral. Like, it's not too little or too much. It's like maybe 1 or 2 decibels above perfectly neutral. But, yeah, that's how much mid-bass there is. So, compared to other $500 sets, the bass, I think it performs like it should. Bass performs well. It's textured, punchy, everything. So if you listen to a lot of like Pierre Bourne, Nev, Tupac, or any rap hip hop music, The Weeknd, the mid bass amount will be a good amount. And male voices, because of that slight bit of added mid bass, they never sound thin. They're always present, full-bodied, and clear. So yeah, and then going up onto the upper mid-range, for me, the upper mid-range was a little shouty. It's just a little bit too forward. So whenever I'm listening to like female voices and male voices, for me, with like a lot of upper mid-range, I lose some of the sweetness. So it doesn't sound like the singer's projecting. And it just sounds like the singer screaming into my ear. Like, it just sounds a little unnatural, if that makes sense. So it loses a little bit of delicacy in being delicate. Because it doesn't sound like, it doesn't have like a smoother texture. It sounds like it's a little more gravelly and forward, a little too forward, if you know what I mean. So yeah, that does introduce like a little bit of like unnaturalness, the upper mid-range for me. So I do think they have to reduce the upper mid-range just by a little bit, because yeah, I felt disconnected from my music sometimes because of the really forward sound. But I'm just being really critical. It's not like that bad, but I'm just giving my opinion on it, what I feel like it impacts. So yeah, that was definitely something I wasn't the biggest fan of, because anything in that around that region, 2, 3, 4K, it could cause a little bit of fatigue, like with the forwardness. So yeah, other than that, the sound is good from the bass to the upper mid-range, even though it could be a little slightly tweaked. And then onto the treble. For me, the treble on this was just kind of underwhelming, especially compared to a lot of the other IEMs I have around this price point. And I'm going to explain to you why. So I have a specific song I test for like any peaks or any harshness. And this IEM was the harshest IEM I heard in comparison to the other IEMs I have. And obviously you won't hear this on every song, but there are those very rare songs, like 5 or 10% of my library, that's a little harder to do and more demanding. And with this, it came off as a little plasticky in the treble, a little harsh, not as smooth. So this is not the smoothest treble around its price point. And when I get into comparisons, I'll be sure to talk about that. So yeah, the treble was okay. It was a little sharp and harsh. And paired with that very forward upper mid-range and a little bit of treble harshness, it's definitely not the most natural IEM I've heard. It sounds a little artificial. The timbre isn't the best. And soundstage, it's okay, pretty average. Imaging, okay for its price. Nothing that blew me away. So now let's get into some comparisons, which I think it's going to make more sense. And if I was a little harsh, I wasn't, because it does do some things better than other IEMs. So these are all under $1,000. This is the Supernova. This costs about $700. Variation costs about $520. And then the top costs about $530. So I'm going to break it down into categories. Let's talk about the bass, mids, and treble. And then I'll talk about soundstage and imaging between these three. So the bass, I would say the top and the variation have a very similar quality of a bass sound. Very, very close in the bass. But because maybe this has a little bit more mid-bass, the bass pops up during the right times slightly better on the top. So strictly speaking for bass, which one's the best one out of these three? I'll go with the top. Has the best bass sound, very clean, clear, not as thin, and everything else. So that's the bass. And then the upper mid-range, for me, which one's the best, would be the Supernova. The Supernova just has a phenomenal upper mid-range because it's well-controlled, full-bodied, forward, but not too forward, like just the right amount, so you hear all the detail in the voices. And it sounds extremely sweet, never harsh, never sharp, no timbre issues. Everything comes across pretty correct. So for me, this has the best upper mid-range. And this one does have that 1.5K slight bit of peak that causes some other issues. So it's definitely not the best upper mid-range I've heard. I'll take the Supernova. And then which one has the best treble? To no surprise, again, the Supernova just edges out the other two in treble. And I'll get into that. So for me, this one, the top had a little bit too much treble. It lacks smoothness. Not the best timbre. Sounds a little plasticky. Maybe around the mid treble. Around that region. Variations, the treble, it's good, but it just lacks a little bit of a sparkle. And it's not the best. It's really smooth though. This has really, really smooth treble. But for me, this is like right in between these two in terms of treble. Where the top is a little too much, variation is a little too less, and this just fits perfectly. So that's what I thought. And then in terms of coherency, I think the Supernova is the best one again. I don't know why, but with this one, I had a hard time like envisioning the instruments or the imaging. It wasn't the clearest I've heard in terms of separation. And it's definitely not as coherent as the Supernova. That's just my subjective opinion, I guess. And the way they mesh their drivers in together on the top is probably not the best. It's not the best. And then the variations and the top have like a similar performance almost. They're very close. If you ask me which one I like out of these two, maybe if I had to live with one, I would go with the top. But both of these have their issues. They're definitely not perfect. Because this one sounds too thin and recessed. It wasn't that shouty for me, the variation. It sounded more thin and recessed. And then the top sounded too forward. And the treble was not the best quality for me. But I'd take the top. Because the bass sounds a little better. And it's not as thin and recessed. And then out of these three, which one do I like the most? I just take the Supernova. It just sounds the most natural. Like, in terms of being natural, this sounds really, really natural. Because the bass is not too much or too little. The vocals are sound really, really realistic. Just excellent tone and timbre. And then the treble is extremely smooth on here. Never harsh, never sharp. Still sparkly. So yeah, these are those three. And then let's bring one of my favorite IEMs right now. This is a Helios. So now let's just compare the Helios with the top. So what was kind of interesting was like the Helios, it measures with more treble air above like 10K. But somehow the Helios has a more linear treble extension. To me, it just sounded, it's obviously smoother. So even with that much treble, you could check it out on the graph. The Helios is still smoother than the top. So I think the treble here was done more meticulously. Just sounds better. Good tone and timbre. Where the top, I don't know if it was a tuning mistake or an engineering mistake. But I was expecting it to be a little better. So if I had to rate all four of these, like from like my favorite to my least favorite, I'd go Helios first, then the Supernova, and then these two are about a tie, to be honest. But maybe the top by a little more. So, but yeah, I saw like these two more, the Helios and the Supernova. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this review. And I do have like the KZ Linglong and the Simgot EA 500 coming for review. So stay tuned for that. And take care, everyone. I'll catch you guys in the next one.